Good day everyone. For today's video, we will be discussing about one of the approaches of morality by J.C. Amen and Gerald F. Krashen. So these are my co-reporters for this video discussion. So we will be talking about the general introduction, the overview of the key ethical issues in this book, and there are also various approaches of morality. But for our group, we will be focusing on analytic tradition and lastly, the perspective on key issues. So good morning, I am Erneliza Cabanlit, the first reporter. So let me start the discussion with a general introduction. So the primary goal of this book is to convey the major concepts and concerns in the field of ethics presented by philosophers from ancient to modern times. So this is the third book of the three-volume series on fundamental philosophical topics. So the first two volumes dealt with philosophy of man and metaphysics respectively. So certain fundamental themes applicable to all elements of this philosophical activity were discussed in metaphysics. So these topics revolve around the fundamental issue of what it means to be or exist. Being included in such truth, change, and contingency, an existence of God was considered as the foundation of being. So the volume of the philosophy of man addressed such essential concerns for a man as his unity in his existence, his spiritual essence, destiny, and his nature of his knowledge. So these two philosophical sciences are referred to as the speculative branches of philosophy because their primary goal is to find the true and satisfactory answers to the question they pose. So what it is to be in metaphysics and what it is to be a man in philosophy of man. Although the conclusions of speculative sciences will have an indirect effect of man's behavior, they do not set out to determine what a man or a being should be. However, there is a practical focus in ethics because it is a non-speculative science that seeks normative norms of behavior. And of course, ethics assumes some metaphysical concepts and a sense of man's nature from philosophy of man, but it is primarily concerned with what a man should do with his activity or conduct as a man. So, more precisely, ethics is a practical philosophical study that aims to discover a guiding principle for those human actions over which we have rational power and fairly responsible. Such deliberate behavior contrasts with innumerable human processes activity that are own actions but are managed automatically and without our choice of direction. So, the moral philosopher is concerned with human acts or activities over which humans have control and responsibility. However, he is not alone in his anxiety. The psychiatrist, theologian, and psychologist are all interested in deliberate and free human activity in their own manner. So the moral philosopher varies from each of them in that he has a distinct point of view. Unlike psychiatrists, a moral philosopher is not concerned with analyzing an individual's hidden motivation or exposing the emotions and sentiments that follows people acts in their daily lives. So the moralist differs from the theologian in that theologian derives his normative morality from the substance of revelation. The psychologist is concerned with measuring and analyzing an individual's emotions and complexes, is not concerned with developing a systematic framework of how men should act. So this last concern is the discovering by reason how a person ought to act identifies the moralist's exact point of view. So this eminent English philosopher John Locke famously noted that humanity had been thinking creatively long before Aristotle produced his logical treatise on how to think. The same may be said about ethics. There were morals long before they were a study of morality. So the student integrates his experience of making and continuing to make moral judgment to his academic study of ethics. The fact that he is a human provides him with ethical experiences. However, having an ongoing moral decision-making experiences is insufficient. Moral decisions is required philosophical understanding, and every man desires a sense of logical consistency in the types of purposeful activity he encounters. He isn't content to act without thinking. He wants to know if his actions are justified or if they are the finest moral choices he could make. So the philosophers presented in this book have furnished explicit analysis of these moral choices. In keeping with the plan of this series, these analyses reflect a pluralistic approach to morality. However, even with the differences so do exist, certain similarities appear in the key positions considered in each section of the book. So let us then address ourselves to these key issues, which will be discussed by the next reporter. Thank you for listening.
Good day, everyone. I am Athena Corectico, and I'm going to tackle about overview of the key ethical issues. So what we are going to discuss is the key issues of analytic philosophy tradition. So here is the most famous quote of William Edward Deming, which is, "If you do not know how to ask the right question, you discover nothing," which is true. So, we have four realities in analytic tradition. So first is the value, second is the obligation, third is the natural law, and lastly is the virtue. So first, we are going to discuss about value. So, value is sometimes defined as the object of human desire and striving. So the technical name for a theory of value is anthology. So from the Greek word "aeschus" is for worthy, logos is for science. So as for classical Greek value, the life lived according to reason is their value, or the end in view proper human striving. So the next one is the naturalistic. As of the naturalistic feels that the best possible fulfillment of the individual in society is attained through the techniques of the behavioral sciences. And as of the Christians, Christian finds value in the good life leading to union with God. And lastly, for the existentialist, value exists in the authenticity of an individual taking his life and his commitments seriously and which full of responsibility. So that's all for value. So next, I am going to discuss about obligation. So we all experience praise and blame in connection with the actions we perform, right? So the obligation is the claim made upon us by reason that some things are to be done and deserve praise, whereas others to be avoided and deserve blame. It is clearly related to the notions of responsibility and freedom. We are responsible for actions when we are ready to account for them to ourselves or to others. So as of Immanuel Kant, 1724-1804, a German philosopher of the Enlightenment, stated that the experienced fact of duty or responsibility implies that we are free. In his words, he said that I ought, therefore I can. The technical name for the part of ethics that deals with obligation is called deontology. So Kant was deontologist in that he placed institution of moral obligation at the very center of his ethics. So next, we are going to tackle about natural law. Natural law, a system of right or justice held to be common to all humans and derived from nature rather than form the rules of society or the positive law. So there have been several disagreements over the meaning of natural law and its relation to positive law. So as of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, held that what was just by nature was not always the same as what was just by the law. That there was a natural justice valid everywhere with the same force and not existing by people's thinking this or that. And that appeal could be made to it from positive law. So that's it for natural law. So lastly, we are going to tackle about virtue. So virtue, the power for moral action that enables man to act with ease and order in some art of his life. These excellences or good qualities have been given emphasis from classical times today. The Greeks sought wisdom in philosophy and prudence and justice in politics. The existentialist stresses courage in the face of a responsibility. So that's it for my report. Thank you for listening, guys.
So good day everyone, I am Kizzel Bea Dabatos and we will tackle about analytic tradition. So what is analytic tradition? Analytic tradition or analytic ethics is described as an attitude towards moral theory that is prevalent today in the United States and Great Britain. The analysts concentrate on examination of language. So in analytic tradition, they believe that before reason, science, logic, and emotions, we must know the language. Without deep knowledge of language, you will understand nothing. That is why, in this tradition, they are more focused on language. So the movement includes logical positivism and analytic philosophy. So when we say logical positivism, it is the rejection of philosophical inquiries on the grounds that there was no possible way of verifying them in experience. In analytic philosophy, it is characterized by an emphasis on language. But the distinction between the two is tenuous. As I said earlier, that this tradition is concentrate more on language, whereas in the earlier, hardcore positivists are more concerned with the model of scientific method and the method of verification in science. They have sought to impose this method of verification on philosophy. However, both the analyst and the positivist are interested in analysis of language as well as in scientific method as a model of philosophy. The analytic movement is in many ways as a continuation of the analytic spirit of David Hume, whose clarity of style and logical rigor are considered exemplary by contemporary analysts. The movement really began with the reaction of George Edward Moore and Bertrand Russell against the Hegelian idealism current in Great Britain at the turn of the century. They rejected it, maintaining that it led to a denial of relationship between things. So Hegelian idealism is meant that the finite world is a reflection of mind which alone is truly real. Instead of accepting Hegelian notion of reality as unity and manifestation of absolute spirit, they considered reality as consisting of discrete phenomena and events, each of which must be examined and named. Philosophic language is seen to be an accurate logic whose function is to describe the atomic facts that are the substance of all that is real. Russell and Whitehead undertook to provide such a logic in their famous Principia Mathematica. The main purpose of Principia Mathematica is to show that philosophical arguments could be solved in much the same way mathematical problems are solved. As a result of this research, British philosophers become more and more interested in the possibility that language could sometimes be very deceptive and create false issues and problems. Brilliant attempt to state the limits of language with the utmost clarity and completeness was made by Ludwig Wittgenstein in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. So, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus deals with the relationship between the language and reality and aims to define the limits of science. At about the same time, Alfred Julius Ayer was convinced that the standard philosophical subjects such as metaphysics are really an abuse of language and ultimately composed of nonsense statements. He came to this conclusion because he could find no way of testing the truth or falsity of many of the statements of idealistic metaphysicians. In his famous verification principle, he asserted that before a statement could be considered meaningful, there must be some criterion to test its truth or lack of truth. His own description of the verification principle and his reason for rejecting the scientific character of metaphysical statement are found in his book Language, Truth, and Logic. The distinctive characteristic of analytic philosophy is its insistence that the moral philosopher be constrained to the use of language that has control of its term and to use of claims that can be warranted true or false, valid or invalid. This movement considers system building as not proper for philosopher and shares with naturalism a respect for and confidence in the scientific method. Like naturalism, it is also protest against the idealistic system of Hegel.
So, hi, I am the next reporter and I will be discussing the perspective on key issues in analytic tradition. So, since analytic tradition is a branch of philosophy that uses analysis, analytic philosophers are not primarily concerned with the realities of value, obligation, law, and virtue. So, unlike the other tradition, the analytic is focused on key issues in naturalistic fallacy, the emotive language, the role of persuasion, and the approach of ordinary language. So for my report, I will be discussing the naturalistic fallacy and the emotive language. So before that, I will introduce you to a philosopher named G.E. Moore. So George Edward Moore is a British philosopher, and he was the one who introduced the term naturalistic fallacy in his book Principia Ethica, which was published on the year 1903. Now let's talk about the first key issues, which is the naturalistic fallacy. But before that, we have to know what fallacy means. So fallacy is a mistaken belief, especially based on unsound argument. So it is also what we call misconception. So in connection to that, the naturalistic fallacy is an informal logical fallacy which argues that if something is natural, it must be good. So we commit this fallacy when we derive ethical conclusions from premises that are not ethical or when we attempt to describe ethical notions with terms that are not ethical. So in addition, Moore said that arguments that use nature or natural terms like pleasant, satisfying, or healthy to make ethical claims were unsound. So for examples, eating chocolates is pleasurable, therefore we ought to eat chocolate. So it is illogical and unsound because the fact is that we can always eat chocolate despite health risks or any other factors and not just because it feels pleasurable. Next is drinking beer is good for the premise that drinking beer is pleasant. For this, purely factual premises about naturalistic features of things in the example, which is the beer, do not entail or even support evaluative conclusions. The last one is breastfeeding is a natural way to feed babies. Therefore, mothers ought to breastfeed their children and ought not to use baby formula. So this is a fallacy. We act against nature all the time, many of which are ethical, and lots of things that are natural are good, but not all the unnatural things are unethical also. So this is what the naturalistic fallacy argues. Now let's go to our next philosopher, A.J. Ayer, or Alfred Jules Ayer. Ayer is an English philosopher and he wrote the book Language, Truth, and Logic, which was published in the year 1936. which is also known as LPL. So, a second major theme of analytic ethics is emotive language, which is a theory of Ayer that can be found in his book, The LPL. So, what is emotive language? So, this theory suggests that ethical language must be sharply distinguished from the use of the sciences or use of language in the sciences. Whereas scientific language can be verified concretely and rendered meaningful, ethical language is emotive. So, in short, the statements of value that contains expressions of emotion cannot be proven factually. So, the heart of the issues is that language that expresses emotion does not add or take away any factual content. So emotive language is not reserved for literature either. It is used in everyday interactions as well. Oftentimes, news headlines use emotive language to hook the audience. So here are the examples. An innocent bystander was murdered in cold blood in downtown Chicago. A monster of a man violated an underage girl. The defenseless victims were attacked in the cover of the night. So in each examples, the emotive words such as monster, defenseless victims, innocent bystanders are not or do not need to be used to communicate a fact. However, this diction creates an emotional response in the audience. So that would be all for my topic. The remaining key issues or key ethical issues will be discussed by the next reporter. Thank you for listening.
Okay, I'll be discussing the approach of ordinary language. But before anything else, let me first define the ordinary language philosophy, which is sometimes referred to as Oxford philosophy. So it is a kind of linguistic philosophy. So linguistic philosophy may be characterized as the view that a focus on language is key to both the content and method proper to the discipline of philosophy as a whole. So for example, in answering questions such as what is truth, we cannot assume that there is some actual thing which the word truth represents. Instead, we must look at the differing ways in which the word truth actually functions in ordinary language. So in this respect, ordinary language philosophers tend to oppose essentialism, in which the idea that all entities have intrinsic properties that can be discerned by reason. So let me further discuss to you about the ordinary language approach. So the ordinary language movement had supplanted the positive movement in England by the 1940s and reached its zenith during the 1950s. Its two main bases were at Oxford, which was associated with Patrick Howard, Noel Smith, and among others, and at Cambridge was associated with Wittgenstein and John Wisdom, among others. So, um, the origin of the ordinary language movement can be traced to some developments in linguistic analysis that motivated a dissatisfaction with the positivist assumption about linguistic sense and the turn to an ordinary use of conception of linguistic sense. So, um, next is the ordinary language approach. At issue is the use of the expressions of language, not expressions in and of themselves. So, for at issue is not, for example, ordinary versus, let's say, technical words, nor it is a distinction based on the language used in various areas of discourse. For example, in academic, in technical, scientific, or lay or slang or street discourses. So, technically or ordinary uses of language occur in all discourses. So, um, So, ordinary language philosophy is generally associated with the later views of Ludwig Wittgenstein and with the work done by the philosophers of Oxford University between approximately 1945 to 1970. So, the origins of ordinary language philosophy reach back, however, uh, much earlier than 1945 to work done at Cambridge University, usually marked as beginning in 1929 with the return of Wittgenstein after some time away to the Cambridge faculty. So, next is the Cambridge period. During the Cambridge period, the genesis of ordinary language philosophy occurred in the work of Wittgenstein after his 1929 return to Cambridge. This period, roughly up to around 1945, represents the early period of ordinary language philosophy that we may characterize as Wittgensteinian. So, the Cambridge period may be characterized as Wittgensteinian because of the ordinary language philosophers of the time were close followers of Wittgenstein. So the philosophical investigations in 1953 further solidified the notion of ordinary language philosophy. So the Wittgensteinians developed more explicit arguments that tried to explain and justify the method of appeal to ordinary language than did Wittgenstein. So indeed, the view was that the appeal to the ordinary uses of language is an act of reminding us of how some term or expression is used in a way. So it has something to do with meaning, to show its meaning rather than explain it. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, Wittgenstein's later philosophy represents a complete repudiation of the notion of an ideal language. So he believed that nothing can be achieved by the attempt to construct one. So basically what he meant by that is there is no direct or infallible foundation of meaning for an ideal language to make transparent. So that's all. Thank you for listening.